why should why should modern scholarship be why is it that so many people are theologians and people particularly interested in the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of Christianity, interested in Michael Polanyi? And then the other question is why he is so less well known, so much less well known than Popper and Thomas Kuhn. And I think the answer to those two questions are related. Welcome to another edition of Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality with me, Nicholas Gruen, and I have a guest that I'm going to do more talking than him, I suspect. Anyway, that's no change. But hopefully that's in the early part of our discussion, and then we'll get on with it. We are Martin Turkis, a school teacher and philosopher in California, and I are writing a book about Michael Polanyi, a philosopher of science particularly, and a number of other things. And I've been trying to work out a bunch of things about him, and two related questions are, why is he so much less famous than Karl Popper or Thomas Kuhn? And why is it that the body of scholars who study Michael Polanyi is so heavily weighted towards theologians? There's a superficial answer to that the second question, which is that Michael Polanyi was a devout Christian, but the thing is that he is not really a philosopher of religion. He spends very little time on religion. When asked, did he believe in God, he said it was like asking someone, or rather, when asked, does God exist, he replied, I'm sure this would not satisfy Richard Dawkins, well, does truth exist? That it's that kind of question. It's the wrong sort of question. So, in other words, I see Michael Polanyi as doing something which I'm quite interested in too, which is locating oneself in the secular world and becoming aware of the inadequacy of a purely secular understanding of the world without going much further, without actually specifying much. He went off to church, I'm not doing anything. But all that there is of religion in Michael Polanyi's major outputs is I think of him as building a kind of an on-ramp to religion at the end of his four most substantial books. The very last page or so, he starts talking about religion, and he builds a kind of an on-ramp, or if you like, an off-ramp, since it's the end of the book, to religion as a parting gesture. So why should modern scholarship be why is it that so many people are theologians and people particularly interested in the philosophy of religion, the philosophy of Christianity, interested in Michael Polanyi? And then the other question is why he is so less well known, so much less well known than Popper and Thomas Kuhn. And I think the answer to those two questions are related. So maybe I don't know whether Martin's got anything to say at this point, but maybe I'll stop talking and see if Martin wants to say anything or suggest how I should proceed.
Well, I'll just make a few comments here. Thanks for having me, first of all. Um, And I'll begin by saying I like the way you phrase that the link to explicitly religious language tends to be a parting gesture at the end of books like Personal Knowledge or The Tacit Dimension. Um, it gets tied into other aspects of his philosophy at that point, but there's almost it's not quite fair to say it, but there's almost a take it or leave it. You can take it if you like it.
Exactly,
But
exactly. It's detachable.
Marjorie,
It's
yeah,
detachable. Yeah,
yeah, Marjorie Green, who pretty influential philosopher in her own right, who worked closely with Polanyi on personal knowledge, was not a fan of that final religious, mystical sounding section of personal knowledge. And there's a fair amount of correspondence, I believe, between the two of them about that. But he kept it in. So I like the way you phrased that. Um, a couple of real quick historical details that I think relate in a real but um, not terribly profound way to the common phenomena having theologians who are interested in Polanyi's work is that in America, at least in the U.S., an early scholar who became really interested in Polanyi's work was William Petit. He taught religious studies at Yale and then Duke University, um, and he mentored a lot of people. One in particular, whom I'm well acquainted with, is Dale Cannon, and basically took them through their doctoral processes, the writing of their dissertations, and he always introduced all of his students to Polanyi. He had a pretty big impact. He was a pretty dynamic teacher, and so he
with
sort of sent
a
out,
large, with a very large vocabulary. I can,
yes, a very large
having tried
vocabulary.
to read him. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, it can be a little bewildering, but so he sent out into the religious studies departments of the land
yeah,
a fair number of people then who were interested in Polanyi. So on the American scene, at least, that's part of where that comes from.
yeah.
But of course, why was Petit attracted to Polanyi in the first place? I think it was for some of the reasons that you're interested in going
Okay.
into here.
So what I want to do now is I want to change tack and hopefully then come back to the question of the religious dimension. And I want to ask this other question, which is why Polanyi is not as nearly as well known and not nearly as mainstream as Popper or Kuhn. And so let me tell you the way the Popper Kuhn thing turns out, which is that Karl Popper, probably almost certainly the most famous pure philosopher of science of the 20th century, comes up with this very radical proposition that we don't, we shouldn't, and in fact, we actually don't use induction in science. We only use deduction. What is induction? Well, induction is the presumption before 1697 that every swan we have seen is white, therefore all swans are white. Well, it turned out in 1697 that somebody came to what is now Western Australia, and found that the swans there were not white; they were black. More compellingly, Bertrand Russell talks about the turkey. Every day it gets up, it gets fed, all its needs are met, and it figures it's in a pretty benign world. And then comes Christmas Day, and the turkey is for Christmas. The turkey is for Christmas lunch. So that is Hume's. David Hume, the philosopher, said that there's this problem, and the problem is that relying on induction is not rational. Now, what he meant by that is not that we shouldn't do it, but that it wasn't it wasn't an indubitable it wasn't an indubitable result of result of reasoning that we could have complete confidence in. There were holes in it, and we were doing it kind of as much out of habit as anything else. And habit is hardly doesn't have a great intellectual pedigree. Hume's position is, however, that we basically have to use induction in one way or another because that's how we learn to do everything. Well, that's how we learn to speak. It's how we learn to ride a bicycle. It's how we learn to walk. We notice that things seem to be associated with other things. When I lean this way, I fall over. I did it. That happens every time I do it, so I learn not to do it. And Popper came up with this idea that science proceeds only by falsification, and the attraction of falsification is that it can be anchored to deduction. And it's remarkable. Popper remains absolutely the favourite philosopher of science of all people, other than of many scientists, of many practical people, and of virtually no philosophers today. And that's because this idea just runs into terrible trouble. And the trouble that was most dramatically illustrated, the trouble that turned up, if you want to, in the public mind, in the dominant tradition of Western philosophy, is this guy called Thomas Kuhn turned up. He had this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he told a story about science which was much more sociological, and it was a story in which scientists see falsification or verification of theories against whole backgrounds of theory, which he called paradigm. And this then produced just endless Popper wars, philosophy wars, culture wars, call it what you may. And before all this, Polanyi had been thinking about this kind of stuff. And he, in fact, published his magnum opus is called Personal Knowledge, but he'd said similar, and that was published in 1958, very philosophical, big, unwieldy, messy, profound, creative, disorganized book. And he'd, in fact, and this was a working out. He wasn't a professional philosopher. He'd been a chemist, then he was an economist for 10 years, and he sort of had taken to philosophy. And I think there's a reasonable case that can be made, and if anyone wants to email me, I'll send them the material. But there's a reasonable case to be made that either consciously or unconsciously, Thomas Kuhn copied a lot of his ideas, picked up a lot of his ideas from Polanyi, and Polanyi himself, who was a generous man, nevertheless thought that had happened and really felt badly about it for his whole life. Now there's another article about by a Polanyi scholar which asks this question: why is Thomas Kuhn's book, published in 1961, I think, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, why is it so successful and Polanyi's much less successful? And obviously that's an input into my bigger question, which is why is Polanyi a boutique? Why is Polanyi a boutique taste among philosophers, whereas and people talking about the philosophy of science, whereas Kuhn is a central figure? So that's kind of the story, and it's true that the disorganization, the difficulty of getting through Polanyi's Personal Knowledge in 1958 had quite a lot to do with it. Kuhn's book is slim, concise, great terms like paradigm. That's, a marketing person would tell him that's going to go a long way, and they'd be right.
Lots
So
of
that's
people know paradigm shift. Lots
yeah,
of
yeah,
people use
everyone's
paradigm shift
constantly
and they
talking
never know
about a
Kuhn.
paradigm shift. Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. So it got into the language. But
Hmm.
I want to argue that there's a much deeper reason, and it relates to what we were talking about before. Polanyi explains all this stuff about frameworks or paradigms or whatever, and provides some very powerful. He actually talks. I mean, he's got an article called "The Stability of Beliefs," published around about 1952, in which he talks about a scientist or science, Marxism or Stalinist,
Hmm.
Leninist Marxism, Marxist doctrine, and the magic beliefs of the Azande tribe from a book that had been written up by a contemporary anthropologist who's famous and whose name is on the tip of my tongue, but I can't get it off. Can you?
Yeah, Evans
Evans
Pritchard.
Pritchard. Evans
Yeah.
Pritchard, that's right. And this is the paradigms argument. This is the idea that these people have that something that looks like a refutation in one paradigm doesn't look like a refutation in another paradigm. It just pulls up an auxiliary hypothesis from that world. So he's well ahead of Kuhn in sort of presenting this. But this is all part of a much deeper agenda. And where Polanyi comes out, where he's always trying to get to, is he thinks of science as much more than a technical discipline. It's not simply a matter of logic or even of creativity. It's a Platon, and this is where Martin, you have written a whole PhD on Polanyi as a Platonist. Science to Polanyi has a transcendent quality, which of course we're not in constant. It being transcendent, we can't say that much about it. But it's about the truth. It's about the human striving to make closer contact, more a greater a contact with greater fidelity to reality. And that word fidelity is very important because fidelity is an ethical concept, faithfulness, and Polanyi argues the most important thing Polanyi wants to say, I would assert, and maybe I'm wrong, but for me, the impression I get is that the thing that is most important to Polanyi, the reason he's making this intellectual journey, is that he thinks science is just one of a few very pure human experiences which reflect what he calls a fiduciary order, an order of faithfulness, an order which is saturated with an ethical substance, if you like Plato's The Good, and with spiritual significance for that. And while contemporary philosophy is very comfortable with the idea that you can't fully separate facts and values, that's as far as it goes. And when someone like Polanyi says, yeah, that's right, and this is what we could make out of this practice, then everyone says, oh, well, that's very interesting. Maybe you'd like to go and talk to the theology department. So there you are. That's my working around to having something to say about both those questions, which have been rattling around in my head for a while now.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think a couple of more points about the distinction between Kuhn's, groundbreaking work and Polanyi's personal knowledge. You've already done a nice summation of those differences, but in addition to the nicer packaging, um, the fact that the reading of Kuhn's work went down a little more easily, I think. It's a little more bite size in terms of its length, probably better organized. It also it was challenging, it was certainly a challenge to people who were in the tradition of Karl Popper, who were persuaded by Popper. Kuhn's definitely challenging them, but it was challenging a rather narrow slice of their
Exactly.
worldview.
That's right.
Whereas what
It
I think
sort of
you're getting
starts
at.
from where they are. It starts from where they are, and it says, "Look, you've got this a bit wrong,
Mhm,
but don't get too upset about it."
mhm, mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, we can. It's workable, but Polanyi sort of dives into the deep end, and keep swimming out there,
yeah,
keep
yeah,
swimming out further and further into the deep end
yeah,
until he leaves you with an image and personal knowledge of kind of a lifeless universe in which life develops in this kind of ever upward ascending complexifying order, and then ends on a religious note and says
yeah.
something like, this is what it's like when a Christian is worshiping God, or something. I'm paraphrasing but pretty closely. Those are the final words in personal knowledge. So that that's maybe a bridge too far for a lot of people if they're trying to maintain a certain kind of secular philosophical respectability.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that it's all or that the you don't need that bit at the end
Mhm.
to notice. And in some ways, it might be better if it's not there. But I'm perfectly happy that it's there, and he wanted it there. And who the hell am I? But you don't need that bit to note. If you're paying attention all the way through the book, you've got this. Polanyi's trying to tell a story to human beings inhabiting a unfriendly universe in the normal scientific vision. And it's not as if he's not telling a terribly comforting story, but he's giving you he's telling a story of ascent, which you've just summarized.
Mhm.
And then that ascent is is spiritualized, is ethicized. It's not just an ascent from an amoeba to an elephant, because it passes through sentience and consciousness. And Polanyi's argument, his conviction, is that in a way Aristotle says something similar, because when Aristotle says, he doesn't say it in these terms, but you can get out of Aristotle the proposition that you can't define a knife without saying what a good knife is from a bad knife is. That's part of the definition of a knife. And that pushes the ethical dimension into the picture. And while modern philosophers are happily accept that, they just don't want any more of it, because it's beyond that point. It's way too countercultural, and that's why Michael Polanyi is a kind of interesting sidelight, and not regarded as central. But I think it would. But if you look at that debate that happened particularly in the 60s and 70s about the philosophy of science, you have Popper, and then you have a bunch of ex-Popperians. They were devout Popper followers, acolytes of him, studied with him, and then they peel off. Lakatos peeled off and was excommunicated. Feyerabend, likewise, although he excommunicated himself. And Kuhn was not so much a Popperian; it wasn't an acolyte, but he's offering, as you say, a narrow critique, from a rather different perspective, an historical perspective, rather than the perspective of the philosophy of science proper. And then you have this other guy who has all along proposed a very different way to think about this. And if he had been the other pole, I think that we would have had a much richer debate, and we would have ended up in a much happier place, which is a place that was a bit more like the universe that Polanyi was trying to write about, which is a universe with consciousness and with sentience and consciousness and ethical sense and some glimmerings of a spiritual of an apprehendable spiritual reality.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's well put. Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's this little nugget. Whether what you think it's a nugget of, different people will differ. But I'll stop the recording here, and thank you very much, Martin, for indulging me.
Yeah. If you've got a spare $120 US currency, you can check out my new book, The Metaphysics of Michael Polanyi on
It
Palgrave Macmillan.
highly recommended, and it will put you in slightly closer touch with the good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.